My name's Mary Dranowski. I'm a beef systems specialist here at the University of Nebraska. Today we have Kacie McCarthy. She's a cow-calf specialist here at the University of Nebraska. And today she's going to talk about culling decisions. So I was joking with her earlier about should she stay or should she go, right? How do you decide who to keep and who to send down on the truck, as well as decisions about how to use pregnancy detection to your best advantage. So with that, Kacie, I'll let you take over.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mary. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Like Mary said, we're going to dive into utilizing some tools like pregnancy detection and how we can implement that with some of our culling decisions. So I'll jump right in to kind of our topic for the night, and really want to set the stage. And hopefully when we're thinking about today's seminar webinar topic, as well as some of our other topics here over the next few weeks, really understanding that all of these really tied together. And so when we think about cow production and reproduction, we want to make sure that that cow is productive for the lifetime that she's on our operation. And so really thinking about how we can be strategic with reproduction, different tools for management, as well as some of our culling decisions, especially when we think about drought scenarios. How can we keep her cows in the herd for 5 to 6 years, recover those development costs, still keep them profitable, and make sure that we're improving our herd genetics and reproductive traits. And so we know that reproductive traits are low. And we also know that one of the main factors causing cows to be removed from the herd is reproductive inefficiency. And so either that cow lost a calf, failed to become pregnant. And so how do all of these start to play a role in who to keep, who to send down the road, and what are some of those decisions that we can make to keep those cows in the herd as long as possible? And so I really enjoy bringing up some of these numbers in terms of management practices, and we're just going to touch a little bit on pregnancy detection, but implementing different types of technologies can also help us improve reproductive performance and try to get as many cows bred during that breeding season as possible. And so we can show a show of hands. Does anybody here on the chat implement any of these reproductive technologies? So maybe we synchronize for estrus, maybe we implement artificial insemination. How many pregnancy tests? Feel free to add comments in the chat, or you guys can raise your hands. Would love to see. Oh, Micah's got hands and clapping. I love it. Anybody else? Preg check, wonderful, good. And we may be a little bit behind the 8 ball here in terms of preg checking season. I know there's a handful of producers that have already gone through pregnancy detection. We've got some that AI and preg check, wonderful. So we've got a handful of comments there, wonderful, love it. But the idea here is, what are some of these technologies that we can maybe think about implementing that are going to help us make some of these decisions? So a very small proportion of operations, and this was from almost 20 years ago, not quite, but it's been a while since this data has been updated, but we still have a low proportion of operations that implement some of these technologies. Oh, we've got some that do ET, wonderful, preg check, AI, blood testing, wonderful. So we've got a handful of those folks that are on tonight that implement some of these technologies, which is fantastic. And so when we think about implementation and management, some of the things that we'll dive into a little more here in today's talk is really about timely management decisions. And so when we implement some of these technologies, we can really try to target some different management strategies. So perhaps we are wanting to decrease calving season length. Maybe we want to improve calf uniformity. Handful of you guys on tonight are implementing some type of AI, increasing those herd genetics, thinking about opportunities to increase early conception. Maybe we're using cedars to get some of our late calving calves moved up into the cycle, into the breeding season. So a lot of great opportunities, and we could talk all night about some of these reasons. But I really just want us to get thinking of how we might be able to implement these and some of the benefits when we start moving into culling decisions. So when I think about pregnancy detection and why it's important, really, this is the baseline of helping us serve as a decision tool, really determine if females are going to stay, or maybe then gives us some opportunities to either rebreed them or sell them as non-pregnant females. And so depending on the class of animal that we're working with here, that starts to give us some options. And I'll talk about that a little bit when we start to really dive into some of our culling strategies. But it really gives us an early warning of any breeding or reproductive problems. It also starts to allow us an opportunity to separate and group females based on stage of gestation, and manage them a little differently depending on if maybe we have some older cows, or maybe our heifers or our 2 and 3 year olds that maybe we just need to manage a little differently in terms of nutrition or health. And then it also kind of helps us when we're thinking about calving distribution, reducing that spread of some of those late calvers, starts to tighten up that calving window, and then ultimately starts to allow us that flexibility of improving herd fertility by culling some of those appropriate animals that maybe are a little later than we don't want to keep them, just due to some late calving, or maybe just later onset of puberty in some of those females. And so what can we do to allow us to make some of those management decisions, think about timing and marketing of some of our open cows, and basically just increasing that flexibility and increasing potential profitability. So a lot of really great reasons why preg checking might be something for us to think about. Now, there are a few different methods when I think about pregnancy detection. We've got a few in the chat that implement blood testing. And so that is something that basically around 30 days plus of after breeding, we can get a pregnant blood sample, send that in, and then we can get results back as pregnant or not pregnant. Now, keep in mind that when we do send those blood tests out, we can't make a decision right there chute side on if we are going to send that female out to pasture or sort her off. We're going to have to work those animals again. And so keep in mind that that is a great and viable option. It's a little cheaper, but we do have results that come a few days later. And so keep that in mind when you're thinking about some of these strategies. If you're working those animals again, this might be an option. Now, we've got palpation that, depending on the timing of rectal palpation and even ultrasound, a lot of this is going to depend on experience from our technician. And so most oftentimes, you're going to have the vet come in, and they're going to be comfortable identifying pregnancies at 30 plus days of age, if not more, depending on the proficiency of your technician. And so keep in mind that we can have some incidents of early embryonic loss. That percentage is pretty low, around 1 to 2%, when we start working with those fetuses that are a little smaller in age. But this also gives us an opportunity early on to be able to make some of those decisions pretty quickly after a breeding season. Now, there might be opportunities if you're implementing ultrasound where you want to actually get the sex of the calf. And so most typically, your vet or technician is going to want to wait till about 55, 60 days, if not more, just so we can actually identify those appropriate anatomical features on the ultrasound that's going to allow us to get that sex of that calf. And so keep in mind that that does need to wait about 60 days or so to be able to identify, if not longer, to really identify those markers. So blood testing is one that basically is measuring a specific protein in the blood, which is going to be produced by the placenta. And this can be identified as early as about 28 to 30 days. Now, like I mentioned, you've got to be able to take that blood sample and be proficient at collecting that. Then you're shipping those samples off immediately. And then it's going to take a couple days to be able to get those samples back. And so keep in mind that if you're trying to make some of those decisions at chute side, that might be an option, that if you're just trying to make some later decisions, that might be advantageous for you if you're running everything through the chute. But keep in mind that you do want to make sure that that sample is taken at least 74 days ish since last calving, because of some of those proteins from the placenta. Make sure that those females do clear out and they've gone through that breeding season, and identify those females at least 30 days bred. So the one question that usually gets asked when we think about pregnancy detection is, when should we schedule it? Now, I've got a few of you guys that implement AI, synchronization, maybe even embryo transfer. And the nice thing about that is really you have a set breed date, right? And so you know exactly when you're going to synchronize those females, when that AI date is. And so, for example, I wanted to throw up a slide here, just identifying. So we had some heifers in this example, bred May 15th. Now we turned bulls out from the 20th of May till July 15, and we ultrasound August 15th. Now, this gives you that opportunity to then identify those fetuses that are AI bred versus those that are bull bred. And so now you start to open up opportunities to manage those groups a little differently. And so especially with heifers, if you know that you have AI bred calves versus bull bred calves, you can manage those groups a little differently, as well as managing any of those opens. And so you start to give yourself some flexibility. And so this is the same if you're going to implement embryo transfer. You have that set date, you have that window. And so when your vet comes in to pregnancy check everything, you can give them a pretty good idea of how long those bulls are in there, how long those, and how old those fetuses should be. And so really being able to identify a date helps from a management standpoint as well. And so you can separate those. And when you start to think about separating our groups come calving, you know, February, March, and April, we can stagger those different groups based on pregnancy date. And so if we have an idea of that window, those females are going to be calving, now we can separate those and really decrease some of that that impacted calf health when we think about calving groups. Maybe even implementing something like our Sandhills calving method, where we can move those groups through our calving pastures, get those cohorts of calves, and ultimately decrease some of our health risks with those calves. So really great opportunity. One, just knowing how to manage those animals, but also some of those later management strategies in terms of managing calves when they hit the ground. Now, just want to kind of talk a little bit about some of those benefits again when we think about early detection. Now, this, when we get into our culling strategies, is really going to be highlighted a little more. But when we have early pregnancy detection, any of those open animals can then be moved from those feed resources. And so maybe we're a little limited on grass like we were this year. Can we then start to move those animals into that higher August, September cull market? Can we move and rebreed them into a fall or a late summer calving group and really start to manipulate some of our feed resources, feed out some of those opens, or maybe graze them on some residue, and then really target a different market for them. Especially with our heifers, when we think about continuing to put some weight on those, now those females can actually enter a yearling or a feeder market and starts to really open up some possibilities if we can get early pregnancy detection done as soon as possible, opening up some flexibility for those animals down the road. Now, keep in mind that all of this has some give and take when we think about early detection. Like I mentioned, understanding that it does take some time to move those animals through the chute. And so keep that in mind, working events and being able to have the right facilities to move those animals through. And also making sure that you identify a vet, have them come out. They're experienced in terms of either palpation or with ultrasound, so we can get some of that early detection diagnosed in terms of pregnancies. Keep in mind that these are also going to allow you some sorting and different management strategies that may be a little more advantageous than working with some of our blood samples, but all really great when we think about just setting up opportunities for thinking about who we keep and who we cull. So speaking of that, throw it in the chat. I would love to see what are some reasons you might cull a cow on your operation. What's one of your biggest traits or your biggest reasons that cows are added to your cull list? So take a few minutes, throw some in the chat. Would love to see when some of this happened and why. Ooh, perfect. Bad feet, broken mouth. Wonderful. Okay, anybody else? Poor temperament. Yes. Bad udders, temperament, crazy, maybe low or high body condition. They're open. Yeah, we just talked about that. Good. Wonderful. Short on feed. Yes. Wonderful. Yeah. So we have a lot of reasons. Yeah. Age might be another one. Great. Great. A lot of really good comments there. Love it. So thanks for throwing those in the chat. So what we're going to talk about and kind of shift gears here is what are ways that we can and when might we be thinking about some of these culling opportunities and reasons why cows might end up on our cull list. So we have a few different time points throughout the production cycle that would allow us opportunities to cull females. And so at birth, we may have some issues, maybe some dystocia issues, and we'd much rather not deal with that female and move her to grass. And so she's going to go on the cull list after calving. We also have pre-breeding or at pregnancy diagnosis, depending on the timeline there, of opportunities to evaluate where our females are at, and then opportunities then to maybe put them on a cull list. We talked about pregnancy diagnosis. This may be before weaning. We'll touch a little bit on early weaning and utilizing that as an opportunity for some of our culling decisions, especially when we start to think about scenarios in drought where some of these opportunities may be better sooner than later. And then genomic testing might also be another opportunity if you're getting that done on calves, where we can start to make some decisions there as well. So a lot of different tools, a lot of different timelines, and all of these are really going to be dependent on time, labor, and what resources you have to be able to get these done. So with that being said, we we really like to think about culling as multidimensional. And so I touched briefly on some of these opportunities that might put those females on a cull list, maybe a retain and rebreed list, or move into a later calving herd. So there's a lot of different decisions when we start to look at our cows that are on that list. Maybe they're open, maybe they are, we touched on this, right? Cow age, maybe body condition score isn't where we need it to be. You know, maybe market conditions are really low. Maybe we're hitting that high, and we're able to sell those in a good time. Or maybe if we're thinking about drought and feed resources and cost, that this might be an opportunity to sell, maybe retain. Maybe we have some corn residue that we can throw these girls on. Maybe we can get some body condition back on them. Or maybe we just didn't set them up and we are really trying to have a nice tight calving and breeding window. But they're really going to work much better in maybe a fall breeding group, maybe a later summer group, or maybe it's an opportunity to target some of these other management strategies of maybe implementing terminal genetics, or maybe we are dealing with some fertility issues and we just don't want to keep those around. So I like to think about this in terms of having some different decisions, different options, depending on the type of cow or even heifer that we're working with. So when we think about culling cows and heifers, you know, going back to kind of that first slide of really setting the stage of understanding that we want to be able to improve and maintain productivity and profitability of our cow herd. And so a lot of that is going to be coming down to that reproductive performance. Are those cows performing? Do we have then maybe an opportunity to be strategic about genetic selection, keeping those females that we really want that are going to be profitable and productive in our herd? Now, this also opens up opportunities for our heifers when we think about culling, really kind of going hand in hand. And, you know, do we keep them as replacements, or maybe now they are in our yearling enterprise, or maybe an opportunity to put them on grass and move into the feedlot? And so having some flexibility, knowing where these animals can go at the end of the day can be really helpful when we think about what those decisions need to be. So who are our candidates? We talked about pregnancy detection early because I really wanted us to start thinking about when and the timing and opportunities for who may be able to stay or who may go. So pregnancy checking, remember, around 30 plus days, that is going to really help you make some of those decisions earlier than later in a breeding season. Keep in mind that experienced technicians can get that done a little sooner. With rectal palpation, we're going to have to wait just a little bit to make sure that we don't have any slips and we can retain as many viable pregnancies as possible. There can be some potential loss there early on. Now, with implementation of pregnancy check, that is going to help us make some decisions on our opens, and they're not pregnant, we're going to send them down the road. But you guys gave me a lot of great comments in the chat of some other criteria or reasons why you might cull your cows. So again, older, mature cows, maybe they have low production records. So we're taking a look at some of our records over the last few years. Maybe they don't fit our system. So maybe they are too big. Maybe they weigh too much, maybe not enough. Maybe they're producing too much milk. And, you know, we had some comments in the chat of, you know, just not having enough feed resources. So what are some of those? Maybe we have some injuries. Maybe we have some broken jaws, temperament. These are all going to be reasons and good candidates for culling. Now, like I mentioned, being able to go back and take a look at individual cow records and identify some of our productive and non-productive females can be really advantageous when you think about opportunities, especially with drought. It may be tough, but really starts to get you thinking about what type of cow do you want in your system. Maybe we have weaning weights that are in that bottom 10% of the herd. And so we can go back and start to look at some of those numbers and look at that ranking. If those cows are kind of in that low bottom half, they could also be potential candidates for culling. So using records, having notes, having comments during calving, having comments when they're coming through the chute. These are all great opportunities to be able to identify some of those candidates for culling. Now, when we think about some of the benefits of early pregnancy detection, and especially if we have some larger, heavier weight cows, really thinking about some of the benefits of detecting early pregnancy and or maybe even early weaning. Now we can capitalize on those cows that may still be in good condition, but they're not bred. And this starts to open up some flexibility with some of our larger, more heavyweight females that we can send them into a market that's going to be a little more advantageous than letting them work through a whole grazing season. And then, after weaning, then we're going to think about maybe sending them down the road. So there's some opportunities here to capitalize on weaning or early pregnancy detection when those females are still in really good condition, and then starts to kind of decline over that grazing season, and then starts to pick back up when we move into winter. So a lot of really good opportunities, being able to take a look at body condition, body weight of those females, and how we might be able to manipulate weaning data a little bit. So when we think about some of those females that maybe they have the calf on their side, but they're open, they're also really good candidates. Also thinking about some of our heifers and how many we want to be keeping as replacements. Now, we actually talked about this last week a little bit, and so I wanted to just make that point again, is even though our heifers may require less total feed than our cows, keep in mind that they're going to need higher quality feed because their nutrient requirements for growth are much higher than a mature cow. So kind of keep that in mind, depending on how many pregnant heifers you're keeping, what some of those nutrient requirements for growth are going to be compared to maybe a more mature cow that is bred, and how we're going to manage those two groups a little differently. So keep that in mind. But we can manage those females a little bit differently depending on how many we want to keep and how many we want to send down the road or into a different market. Now, this year maybe could be one that we've touched on in terms of forage and pasture resources, maybe being limited. And so I talked about some of the benefits if we can early wean and or get early pregnancy detection done. We can sell that cow with a calf that's 45 to 90 days of age, and send them down the road, and or opportunities to early wean, increase potentials for reproductive performance in terms of opportunities to reduce those lactational demands, and then hopefully be able to capitalize maybe a little later in that breeding season where we can get a few more females pregnant. So a few different strategies there. And also thinking about some of our other classes of animals. So herd bulls. If we're not going to need X number of bulls in our bull battery for the following year, this is also an opportunity maybe to think about age of our bulls. Maybe they haven't passed a breeding soundness exam. Maybe they're coming around to needing to go down the road because we've got daughters that are coming of age in the breeding season. So how are we managing our bulls as well? Think about those different classes of animals on the operation, all as potential candidates for culling. So I mentioned rebreeding a little earlier with some of our heifers. Now, heifers can carry some risk as rebreeding is open older cows, maybe because there's some inherent fertility problems. Maybe they just weren't pubertal at the time of the breeding season. Whatever the case, understand that if we have females that need to kind of move later into a breeding season, that they may just not be fitting in that particular system. And that's okay. They may have opportunities to move into a later summer or maybe into a fall bred system where if they do get bred later, that opens up opportunities for a calf on the ground, and or we may have opportunities to move that female into either a heiferette or into a feedlot scenario because they don't take on those couple extra chances, and then gives them some flexibility. Now, you may have an opportunity also with some of our older open cows that maybe we want to fit them into a terminal system. We just want to be able to get calves on the ground. And so we're going to throw a bull in with some of those open late cows and basically just target that terminal system. Those calves are directly going to a feedlot. So there are some options depending on feed resources and space that these animals might be able to move into a rebreeding scenario. Now, moving those open cows to that different season really starts just to open up opportunities for different calving seasons, different markets to be able to sell those animals in, and can also increase that cow value above an open cow. And so if we're looking to maintain or start to increase that herd size again, if we had to cull pretty hard, maybe the last few years, opening up some of those opportunities to have bred cows instead of open cows may be advantageous if we are looking to increase that herd size. So lots of options when we think about moving those cows and where they could go. So when might be a good time to sell some of those non-pregnant cows? Now, I know August is past, but the biggest thing that we need to be thinking about here is what's our market and where are these animals going to be going? And so if we can target maybe earlier in August instead of October, November, where prices are going to be a little higher early on, that might be able to help pinpoint some different time points for marketing. Now, cows that are nursing a calf will typically lose weight, kind of showed that graph earlier. And so keep in mind that if we are weaning when we still have pretty high forage quality, we can get some of that condition back on those cows before we really start to see that decline in our forage later on now into more of the dormant season here this fall. So opportunities earlier than later, but keep in mind that our cull cows represent about 10 to 20% of our gross revenue on the operation. And so there's a few really good candidates that may be able to fit this market if they don't rebreed, if maybe we don't want to worry about that, but we have some forage resources, we may be able to throw them into that cull cow market where we are putting body condition, they're in good condition, they have good muscling, and really thinking about what body weight they're coming in at. We really can start to capitalize on some of that cull cow value that really is going to be based on that percent lean meat yield and that live weight. So if we're really targeting those females early, we may be able to capitalize on some of these market benefits as well. So again, I talked about where if we can maybe hit that high in the market, August, September, we start to see that decline because what's happening here right now, everybody's preg checking and weaning. So we start to see that flood of the market a little bit with our cull cows. And then those numbers and prices start to come back up. So there may be opportunities where we can capitalize on some of these higher points in the market when we think of that average later on, when we start to get into now our time point in October, where we start to see that price start to decline. So understanding that the timing of the market, when you're going to be doing some of these management considerations with, early weaning, pregnancy detection, all of that starts to have different effects on when that market and those prices are going to be advantageous, depending on your scenario. So when we think about keeping some cows, so we decided we're going to cull them. Now, maybe we have some feed resources to add some value. Biggest thing, if those females need to gain weight, we have an opportunity to put some weight back on them, maybe replenish our muscle, depending on how long we want to keep them in maybe a dry lot or, have them on feed. We have that opportunity to go from yellow to white fat, depending on the type of grains we might be able to increase in that diet and get a little more starch in there to change that fat. Maybe we're trying to hold on to them to really think about market timing, like that slide I just showed. Maybe we have some cows that have some lameness issues. Maybe we have some residue issues. Maybe they were sick and we needed to hold on to those females. And so keeping them in that feed group may be advantageous, really, to try to add some premium and add kind of a different marketing spin to those females. So who would be good candidates to keep and feed? So those that might be a little more on the thin side or lightweight side, but they're healthy. Maybe they have some lameness issues that we're needing to just keep them over for, a month or two, or some that may be on a residue hold and we need to keep them. Now, if we have some of our real fat females or unhealthy females, these would be ones that need to go down the road, right? If there aren't going to be thrifty and thriving in this type of scenario, we need to be able to send them down the road at appropriate time to make sure we can capitalize on any issues. But keep in mind that there are just some candidates that keeping that extra time on feed aren't going to help them any, depending on what ailments we might be dealing with. And then good feeding candidates, depending on pregnancy status, where they're at in pregnancy, we may be able just to put them into a different marketing group and capitalize on that. So at the end of the day, when we're really thinking about adding value, is really thinking about what group of animals we're keeping. And so not all beef cows are going to be old at harvest, right? And so depending on our group of animals that we have on our list. So maybe it's our 8, 9, 10-year-old cows, or maybe it's our 2 and 3-year-old cows that just are struggling to get bred. We may have a diverse group of animals that are in that cull group. But the nice thing about these groups of cows are that potential of being able to send them into a market that is going to add a high percentage of lean beef. We're not adding more animals in terms of feed yard capacity, and these animals are actually going to a market that's going to be demanded in terms of supply for that lean percent of meat. So we do have options for any and all of these animals depending on that status and what resources we have. So at the end of the day, just want to hit a few take-home messages here. In terms of some of our market cows, they do play a large role in that supply chain. And so keep that in mind, depending on who you're going to keep or who you're going to sell. There are premiums and discounts depending on weight. If they're fat, if they have muscle or light muscle, maybe we're dealing with some lameness issues. Add value to them first so you don't get dinged when you sell them to that cull market. When we think about cow prices, that fluctuation really is going to increase about 15% from November to March. And so if we can add pounds and add value to those female, be smart about when they're going to hit that market. If we're feeding open cows from November to February, that's typically been profitable. This was out of some cattle facts data, the last 27 of the last 27 years. This is a few years ago. It was profitable to be able to keep those cows over and feed them if you have the resources. When we have those sick or injured animals, make sure we're smart and we're thinking about the welfare of those animals. But we will see some discounts depending on some of the ailments. So just keep that timely and be conscientious of the welfare of those animals when we get them down the road to market. So at the end of the day, I know we've been talking a lot about who are some good candidates to keep. The best thing and the advice that I always like to go back to are, what are your records? What are your goals? And understand you have some reasons. We talked about that earlier in the talk of who are your candidates and why those animals may be on that cull list. So take a look at those records, use those to make your decisions. If we can implement pregnancy detection and cull early, that's going to open up opportunities to add those animals into some different marketing groups. And so that might be an opportunity to rebreed, maybe to feed, or maybe to sell. And so have an idea of what class or what group those animals might fall in. And it opens up some opportunities when we think about implementing some of these tools like pregnancy detection, early weaning, and then opportunities maybe to feed or rebreed. So opens up lots of opportunities. And with that, I'll take any questions. Feel free to add those to the chat, or you can unmute. Be happy to answer any questions you guys have.
Yeah, so I'll echo what Kacie said, open it up to questions. I guess, Kacie, just to start it off, I know that one of the things that we talk about with drought management plans is having some criteria set up ahead of time for how you're going to cull. And I think one of the things that, as we look at the list here of things people think about for culling, right, they're kind of the obvious ones, if that makes sense. So how do you start digging deeper if you do decide that, given the feed resources, as somebody mentioned, they're short on feed? How would you, what advice would you give them in terms of other things they might think about at this point? It's always easier to make decisions very early and then just enact a decision versus making a decision while it's happening. So right now it's a little bit harder, but what are some ideas about things they might start looking at beyond kind of the typical criteria?
Yeah, great question. So when we're thinking about setting our criteria for our cull list, I really like to think about what your goals are for your operation. So go back to that. Go back to your records, look at some of your benchmark data in terms of, where cows are at in terms of calving distribution. Maybe we've got some late calvers that consistently are in that bottom of the group. Maybe we have some cows we mentioned that the weaning weights are in kind of that bottom half or 10% of the herd average. And so keep in mind that our records are really going to help start to tease out some of those not obvious culling group or criteria. So I really like to go back, think about what your goals are, how many animals you need to be keeping, what resources you have, and what options or maybe what buckets those animals might be able to fall in, depending on rebreeding options to maybe move them to a different season, a different group, and then what we might be able to keep and maybe feed or send to the cull market.
Yeah, so I guess I hadn't thought about like the late calvers. That's to make your calving season a little bit tighter, and likely late calvers are more likely to come up open the next time around. So that makes a lot of sense, and I hadn't thought about that one. So that's good advice. We do have a question in the chat. It says, if a person were to save open cows and turn bulls out with them to make them into fall cows, what's the best way to market fall bred cows?
Oh, great question. So there are a few different options depending on where you're at. Sometimes there are there's fall sales that can target some of those fall bred cows. There's opportunities to do some direct marketing if you've got some operations in your area that are actually in that fall system. Out of state, and when we start to move even down south a little further, and maybe even out west a little more, we do start to see some groups and operations that will capitalize on fall cows. And so there are opportunities depending on maybe where you buy your bulls. They might have some clientele that are looking to maybe expand in that fall herd market. So I think there's a few different options depending on what resources you have available in your area in terms of auctions, fall sales, catalogs, and different marketing tools online. But those would be kind of where I would start. And if, we have some other folks that work in that market, be happy to see what works for others too, if anybody does sell in that fall market. Great questions. But yeah, I think having that flexibility, if you do save some open cows and turn a bull out, I know there's always folks that are looking for some of those cows. Maybe they're looking to add to that market. So I would reach out to folks in your area and see what you might be able to do, because I think there's lots of different options depending on what you're trying to market.
Okay, well, I think if we don't have any additional questions, we'll kind of wrap it up for today. Feel free to make sure to think about registering to join us next week. I'm the speaker next week. I'm talking about stretching hay forage. I'm talking about stretching hay, which the idea on that is really talking about, because we had such low hay production this year, what are ways that we can feed less hay? And so we're going to talk about reducing waste. We'll talk about opportunities to also reduce intake, as well as thinking about how you might couple that with supplementation and some strategic feeding. Looks like we did get one more question. And that question is, will the cull market be better next year because of the amount of cull cows this year? It's a great question, James.
Great question. And I'm trying to remember if Jay touched on any of that last week.
Well, I think, we don't have crystal balls, right? But I do think that if you look at where we currently are in the market, we're setting ourselves up to be very similar to what we saw in 2012.
Yes.
And if you guys can remember what came after 2012, we had very high market prices in especially 2014 and 2015, if I remember correctly. So, there's other things that can affect markets, of course, but I do think that you're on the right track, that the idea is that likely we're unloading a lot of cows right now, which means cow prices and even cull cow markets should be increasing. Of course, cull markets are affected a lot by Brazil, Australia, and some of the other places where we actually bring in beef, ground beef, essentially. So lean beef. So sometimes that's a little bit harder to suss out what's going to happen with the coal market because there's a lot of other things that can impact it.
Yeah,
Sorry,
great
James.
question. Yeah.
I don't know that I have a great answer for you, but I think you're thinking correctly.
Yeah. And I think there's our Center for Ag Profitability group does some of that market trends. And Dr. Elliot Dennis, I think, has some of those projections on their website.